Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning in one of our series of webinars, which CDH has been publishing not only on its own YouTube channel, but also on various platforms of social media. So if you do see and find that this presentation is relevant, feel free to pass it on to everybody. We're happy to have this conversation with you all on a topic which in this age of COVID is extremely relevant. Today we're talking about mental health in the workplace, and I know that there is a lot of ground for us to cover, so I'm going to dispense with the pleasantries and I'm going to just fall straight into the presentation by introducing our first speaker in the matter, who's Tanya van der Water. Tanya is a clinical psychologist with 7 years experience in private practice. She currently practices in the Midvaal area and consults widely online. Tanya is joining us to discuss what is normal in the context of COVID-19, remote work and the interplay between individual personalities, when to call for help when you're suffering from a mental illness, and her contact details will be distributed to you all at the end of this recording. Just to let you know that this recording will be emailed to each and every one of you who've attended the webinar. So sit back and relax. You will have an opportunity to revise what we have said, and I hope that you find the information that we share herein very relevant and topical. Thank you, Tanya.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad that I can share a little bit about mental health at work, in particular mental health with regards to remote work. In this time, there have been so many changes in the last few months, and the impact on our society, our economy, and also our mental health has been profound. So I hope that today's talk will be helpful for you. Just to let you know, this PowerPoint will also be made available to you, so you don't have to worry about it. Just sit back, relax, and enjoy. So let's just have a quick recap of what Corona has done to us, all the stresses related to Corona. So we have lockdown. That was stressful. Remember when the president just announced the lockdown, all the fear and anxiety that went with that, the unknown, the uncertainty, and now it's kind of become normal. We're adjusting to it as the levels are getting better. The impact on finances, I think there is not a single family in South Africa who has not been impacted by financial stress in this time. Illness, the fear of illness, fear specifically around COVID, but also fear of going to hospital or seeking help because I'm ill, because I'm scared when I do go to hospital, when I do go to the doctor, I might get COVID. So even other type of illnesses have been exacerbated in this time. Then we've had to adjust to remote working. I know before lockdown started, I had no idea about Zoom and about Teams and all these things. So I had to learn a lot in order to adjust. And the workplace has needed to be so agile in order to overcome this really weird time. Then all this time that we've been stuck together in our homes with our families have really shown up the family dynamics at play. So you might have thought that your family's kind of okay, we're coping, but being stuck in a house together, trying to homeschool and work and just absorb so many different tasks, it's really been stressful. And then those families or those relationships that may have been tense before lockdown started have been placed under fire in this time. Then we have those who were exposed to previous trauma may have been especially more prone to experience this lockdown time, the COVID-19 pandemic, as an additional trauma. And his research shows that those with a history of trauma are more prone to re-traumatization in the future. So this also has an impact on mental health. Then you might have those who have pre-existing mental health concerns. So maybe you are prone to depression or prone to anxiety or substance use. This stressful time, the stressor, then exacerbates your pre-existing mental health concerns. There's this term that we call moral injury. It's this process that takes place where we need to make tough calls, we need to make difficult decisions that might go against our instinct, our moral code, our ethics. So this often comes into play in the healthcare setting, where a doctor might need to make a call between taking one patient off the ventilator to give another person a chance. Those really difficult things pertaining to lack of resources, and you want to help everybody, but sometimes you can't, and that can have a profound impact on your mental health. Thoughts about death. I think that where we are at in the pandemic, we do not only know about people who have experienced financial difficulty because of COVID, we also know of people close to us who have had COVID. And I think in the future, as things carry on, I think all of us will know somebody who has died because of COVID. And it might not be directly because of COVID, they may not have died of COVID, but because of all the complications that go with it. People die, and bereavement in this time is so challenging to manage because of all these regulations that are in place. So thinking about our death, our parents' death, grandparents, these existential issues, they're very uncomfortable, and this can be very stressful. And then let's not even mention school. So I have a 3-year-old at home, but there are many children, who are trying to adjust to a new way of school, going to school with masks, trying to figure out how to homeschool, trying to figure out how to balance juggle all these balls. The impact that it has had on the children obviously also has an impact on the parents. So we shouldn't underestimate how stressful this corona pandemic has been immensely stressful. There has been a metaphor going around that if you consider a vase, that you put flowers in, it might have a small little fracture in it, a small little crack, but the vase can still do its job. It can still hold and maintain the flowers and keep a little bit of water in to, do its job. But during this pandemic, the amount of stresses that we have faced is not just the little bit of water that we would usually put in the vase. It's more like trying to hold this cracked vase in front of a fire hydrant, this gushing stream of water. Obviously, it's going to crack. So you may have coped before with a lot of stress, but because of the amount of stress and the compound impact of these stresses, these small fractures that we all have and we all carry, nobody's perfect, obviously. Because of this, people can start falling apart. The human nature and humankind is very resilient, which I find so encouraging. But do not be surprised when you find that, you know what, actually I'm not coping as well as I thought. So let's have a look at what has been happening. So the human experience of COVID-19, I've mentioned here the list of stresses that we have faced, but what does it look like when we face these stresses? So Ellen Kubler-Ross, she did research on people who are in the process of dying. I'm not saying we're dying, but they're in the process of dying. And she established this process called the grief cycle. And I think during COVID-19, this grief cycle is so applicable that we experience a myriad of emotions, and it's a mess. It's an emotional mess. It's not linear, it's not progressive, it's not predictable. It's my process, it's not the same as somebody else's process. So in this time, we can feel a little bit isolated, not just because of social distancing, but because of our emotional experiences during these times. So let me explain this model to you quickly. So she said that during the grief cycle, during the grief process, you experience feelings of denial. No, this isn't happening. This is something that happens in China. It doesn't happen in South Africa. This is something that happens to this is something that happens to those who have traveled and who are rich. It doesn't happen in my suburb. It doesn't happen to my people. The denial initially, the job losses, it happens to other people. It doesn't happen to my family. Denial. Then we also have a process called anger, just this incredible sense of rage and anger, annoyance, frustration, that this is so unjust and everything about COVID-19 has been unfair. It's not fair that we need to stay at home. It's not fair that some people get money and others don't. It's not fair that some people do all the effort and others get off easy. There is a lot of anger. And I think this anger was really beautifully illustrated in the Floyd matter that arose in America. It's like our society is a ticking time bomb. We have been limited, and there have been so many rules and restrictions placed on us that we feel angry. And what do we do with that anger? Then we have a process that we call bargaining. This is all part of the process of grief and loss. That, you know, if I do this, then this will happen. You know, if I can just, you know, wash my hands 10 times a day, then I know for sure that I won't get COVID. But unfortunately, we don't have that certainty. So this bargaining is our way of trying to cope with things, but actually, you know, there's no magical thinking here. There's no magic that can happen. We do our best, but we can't predict the future. We can't control these things. And that is so uncomfortable for us as humans. Then there's the depression. I'm not saying the clinical depression necessarily, but the depression that I'm talking about here is that immense feeling of loss, the sadness, the loss of my freedom, the loss of movement, the loss of social connectedness, the loss of being part of a team where I know my part matters. There's been a lot of loss during this process. So like I mentioned in the beginning, this is not a linear process. It doesn't happen step by step. You know, if I've completed my denial phase, I know I'll never go back there again. It's more like a tornado. It spins and it spins and it spins, and you go all over the show all the time, and that is exhausting. Your emotions are drained because of all these feelings that are going around. Part of the process, and this is where we hope to end eventually in terms of grief, is that we reach a point of acceptance. This is the reality. I don't like it. It sucks, but I can accept this and I can carry on despite it. So let's have a look at how COVID-19 has impacted the workers' need, the employees' needs. So this is a triangle. You may have a pyramid you may have seen before. It's called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. He says that there are various needs that a human needs to fulfill in order to self-actualize. So that top part of the pyramid, the win, is self-actualization, where I perform optimally. I do my best work. So for your employees, for your colleagues, remember that our physical needs are being challenged right now. It may be challenged because I'm not receiving the income that I need to be able to fulfill my most basic needs for food and water and taking care of my family. But it can also be that all of a sudden I'm working from home at an uncomfortable desk because it's not work, you know. My screen is at a funny angle, my chair feels funny, I've got kids running around and there's noise distracting me. My physical environment is, my physical needs are not being met in the remote working space. Then let's say we sort those things out, all right? You get the right internet, you get the right data and all those things that you can carry on with your work. The next thing then is security. You need to be able to provide your people with a sense of security. And because COVID-19 is an ever-present threat, our sense of security has diminished. So security here also refers to having financial security, economic security, job security. So in this economic climate where jobs have been lost and companies have had to change and adjust and adapt, people are feeling very anxious about their job security. So you need to make sure that you can fulfill that need for your employee. Then we have the social need. So if you don't fulfill the basic needs, the top needs won't matter. So my advice to clients is always to make sure that you take care of the basics first before you expect miracles, right? So take care of the physical, take care of the security, then take care of the social needs. So in working remotely, all of a sudden, I'm no longer seeing my colleagues on a day-to-day basis. I can't just pop in with my cup of coffee and say hi. Things are different. And specifically the extroverts I have found in my practice, they really are struggling to cope because they thrive off the energy of the group, of the team. So it's not that they're not self-driven, it's just the way that their personality is structured, that they just can't do it through a screen. It's immensely challenging. So our personality, and this is what we're going to get to in a minute, but our personality has a big impact on how we cope with remote working. So let's say you can take care of your employee, your colleagues' social needs, making sure that those needs are met. I feel valued, I feel part of a team, I can connect with those around me. The next thing then is the ego needs, to make sure that I feel valuable, I feel that my job is worthwhile, I'm contributing in a meaningful way. So the normal feedback processes you had while you were working in the office or in the traditional way, all of a sudden these processes have changed. I may have been able to see in the way that my colleague's body language is postured, I would be able to see that, okay, that was good. I get that feedback immediately. And now by just using phone calls or emails or whatever it is, those needs may not be met. So remember that we are complex human beings. We are not just workers. We are not just a workforce who arrives at work and says, okay, reporting for duty, I'm a robot and I can just perform. We are social beings as well, with a lot of other needs. So to get the best out of your employee, to make sure that they are there for the win, they can self-actualize, they do their best work, we need to make sure that their needs are being met. And this is done in community. As an employer, you might not be able to do this in isolation. You need to be able to refer and connect with other resources in the area, in the community, to make sure that your employee is taken care of. So let's have a look here. So personality theory, I'm going to just give you a quick little crash course because I want to challenge you to rate yourself. What do you think you are? Personality theory, there are many theories. I'm going to teach you one, the 5-factor model. And its acronym is OCEAN. So the first construct is openness. O for ocean is openness. So are you open to experience? Are you eager to try new things? Or are you a bit more conservative? You prefer to take things the traditional, normal way, like just stick to what works for me. I don't want to change. The second thing I want you to rate yourself on, are you conscientious? So conscientiousness in this construct means, are you organized and thoughtful and you are diligent at getting the work done? Right? Or are you more of a spontaneous person who goes by the flow and things get done eventually, but not necessarily in a structured, organized manner? Then we have extroversion. Extroversion is the personality structure that says that I get a lot of my energy or most of my energy by interacting with other people. I can be by myself, but if I had to choose between being stuck for 100 years on an island, would I rather be stuck with 100 people I don't know, or would I rather be stuck on my own? So introvert would say, definitely by myself. I don't want to get to know new people necessarily, and they're strange and uncomfortable. The introvert gets energized by being alone. So are you more extroverted or more introverted? Remember, all of these things are continuums. The fourth construct is agreeableness. Remember, all of these words together spell ocean. O is openness, C conscientiousness, E extroversion, A agreeableness. So agreeableness, this construct refers to whether you are friendly and kind to others, or are you a bit more withdrawn or more confrontational. You prefer you need to win, right? So the agreeable person is kind of like the peacemaker. I'm willing to adjust and adapt in order to maintain this type of sense of peace. Or the other side of the continuum is the person who says, I don't care about the peace, I just want to get it done. I don't need to please people. Then the last one is what we call neuroticism. Neuroticism is whether you are moody and easily frustrated, or are you very relaxed and chilled, phlegmatic. Those are the 5 constructs. So in your mind, I want you to just ask yourself, are you more open or closed to new experiences? Are you organized or disorganized in the way that you get stuff done? Or do you get your energy by being with a group or by being on your own? Do you want to keep the peace, or do you want to get the job done? And are you easily frustrated, kind of highly emotional, or are you very chilled? Right. So this is what the research shows about how these different constructs interact with remote work. So those who cope better with remote work are those who have high levels of openness. So you can understand how this makes sense because they're willing to adjust, they're willing to change, they're willing to try new things. And also those who have high levels of agreeableness, so they're willing to adapt, they don't confront during change, they just go with the flow, keep the peace. And those who don't have as much need for being with other people, so those who are more introverted, those tend to cope better with remote work. Those who struggle with remote work are those who tend to be a bit more disorganized. So I need my structures to be in place in order to perform better at work. So now that I need to do this at home, I'm struggling to put those things into place. And the other one, the group that struggles, is those with high levels of extroversion. I need to be with a group. And then neuroticism, interestingly, those who are moody and easily frustrated, those emotional persons, you will find that their neuroticism will flare whether they are working at work or at home. So that was just an interesting finding about that research. But my question is, what is normal anyway? How do we know what normal is? All of these things, all of these ways that we are trying to cope in this time are our attempts at a normal reaction to an abnormal event. None of us have been in a pandemic before. None of us have survived a pandemic before. So how do we know? And that's the other thing that's coming through with research is what is normal? How do we know? Like, if I'm more tearful than usual, does that mean that I'm abnormal, or does it mean that I am actually having a normal reaction to an abnormal event? So with that challenging question, an open question that doesn't really have an answer, I want to suggest that these are signs that you need to ask for help. So if you notice that you have a depressed mood, so not just sad. Sad means that I'm kind of blue, but depressed is that I feel empty inside, I feel numb on the inside, I'm more weepy than, like way more weepy than usual, and that this has been happening more days than not. All of us have mood swings, all of us have down days. A depressed mood is something that stays, it sticks, you can't get out of it. Overwhelming anxiety. So with all of this uncertainty and all of these difficulties around us, we are feeling anxious, we are feeling uncertain, we are worrying. If this anxiety is overwhelming you, it's impairing you, you are not able to sleep, you are impaired in your occupational, so your work functioning, and you're struggling within your relationships. You know, you're more snappy, and your relationships are really frail at this point in time. Those things might be signs that you need to ask for help. Remember, with suicidal thoughts, this is also a really important point. You know, sometimes people say that people who talk about suicide are just like looking for attention. Suicidal thoughts must always be taken seriously, because even if it is for attention, you just need to do one small thing wrong or go too far and you're dead. So suicidal thoughts must always be taken seriously. And for these things that I've mentioned here, what you want to do is you want to refer these people to a psychologist, maybe to a GP or to a psychiatrist, so that they can get help. Often in workplaces, you have an employee wellness program, refer your colleagues there. And then there's also a bunch of free resources available, you know, so should you feel like this is just too much, but you know, just thinking about needing to pay for these services or so much, remember there's a range of free services available. So during all of this crisis, this pandemic, don't underestimate the impact it has on our mental health. It's important that we take care of ourselves. Nobody else will. There's, remember when we were still flying around the country, the air hostess would say, remember when the masks drop, you need to apply your own mask first. And it's the same at this point in time. You need to make sure that you are okay so that you can take care of others. So that's all from me today. I'd like to hand over to Michael and take us further.
Michael, please unmute.
Sorry about that. Tanya, thank you so much for that very useful information. I think that everybody has been listening with peaked ears, and I think a lot of us can find relevance in what you have said in our own personal lives. But for those of us who manage employees as well, hopefully you've triggered some thoughts with them, that they can identify some of these factors with employees under their charge. If you will just allow me a couple of statistics before I dive into the legal aspect of mental health in the workplace. It's just important to realize that when dealing with mental health in the workplace, there's been a study conducted by the South African Depression and Anxiety Group back in 2015. This is based on the South African workforce, and what has been found is that when mental health issues get raised with managers in the workplace, there's a staggering 30% of managers who have a negative response to such a disclosure. 39% of managers are somewhat indifferent to the information that's being shared with them, and unfortunately only 31% of managers actually have a helpful or a positive response to mental health issues that are brought to their attention. Up to 40% of mental health issues in the workplace relates to depression-related matters. 21% relates to bipolar disorder, and 16% relates to anxiety-related issues. One of the biggest pitfalls, I suppose, in terms of mental health in the workplace is that only 61% of mental health issues are actually disclosed to managers, which is a bit concerning, because as you will find out a little bit later in my presentation, mental health has actually got a profound impact on the productivity of employees, but also on the bottom line of your business. Now, I think it's common cause, or at least it's generally accepted, that adverse mental health outcomes are as a result of a combination of various factors, which involve genetic as well as environmental factors. While in the workplace, it's not the only relevant factor, because there can be extraneous circumstances that contribute towards an employee suffering from mental health. It's important to state that our occupational health and safety places a duty of care on employers to manage risk of psychological harm to its employees arising out of the workplace and arising out of the duties that the employee performs in the workplace. We also have the South African National Standard, which is the newly introduced standard of SANS 45001, which recognizes that as part of an employer's duty in the workplace involving safety, this includes the promotion and protection of its employees' physical and mental health needs. I think in light of the COVID situation, where there has been a fourth industrial revolution, so to speak, the work from home principle has crept in for many of those employers who are lucky enough during the COVID lockdowns to have been able to work from home. It is safe to say that those environmental issues, those environmental factors of the workplace have now moved from the controlled office environment into an uncontrolled space. And that is where we are sitting with a conundrum of having to deal with a lot of new challenges, which we have historically and traditionally not dealt with. Now, the biggest problem that we have is that we don't really have a definition of health per se in terms of our Occupational Health and Safety Act. We do have a definition of healthy, which in terms of our OSHA Act is defined as free from illness or injury attributable to occupational causes. However, the International Labour Organization and the WHO, the World Health Organization, has got a far more comprehensive definition of mental illness in the workplace. What the ILO and WHO say is that it says that it's the promotion and maintenance in all occupations by preventing departures from health caused by their working conditions. It also involves the protection of workers in their employment from risk resulting from factors adverse to health. And this is the important one, is the placing and maintenance of workers in an occupational environment adapted to their physiological and psychological capabilities, and the adaptation of work to people and people to their jobs. And I think that is pretty profound, that the approach from the international authorities is that you adapt your work to your people and not necessarily your people to your work. This brings me to an interesting anecdote that we find in the workplace, because it is generally accepted that if you have an employee that suffers an injury, let's call it a broken arm or something of the sort, that there would be a reasonable accommodation within the workplace to make sure that that employee is accommodated given the injury, and that whatever his or her functions are, that the employer does not contribute to further aggravate that injury. But a similar kind of consideration is not paid to psychological injuries, which is an interesting factor, and it's perhaps just because we're not mindful enough of the impact that psychological injuries are also seen to be physical injuries to the employee, and therefore we should also be providing the same kind of accommodation to employees with mental health injuries or issues as we would an employee with physical injuries. Interestingly, in terms of a report undertaken by PwC in 2014, and I believe that this was either an American or Australian report, it was done on behalf of Beyond Blue. It was found that mental health conditions present substantial costs to organizations through absenteeism or even presenteeism. And presenteeism is just the concept where your employee is at work, but they're not at work in their mind. They're not efficient. They are not actually working, but they're filling a seat because they're expected to be there. But what the PwC report has found that for every dollar spent on the successful implementation of an appropriate action to address mental health in the workplace, the organization can expect a return of 2.3. What that basically means is for every dollar spent on successful implementation of an action program, you can expect a return in benefit equivalent to $2.3. So it'll actually pay employers to implement strategies and programs successfully, importantly, in order to see these kind of returns. Now, it brings me to how our labour courts have approached mental health going forwards. And we have recently had a case that has come out of our Labour Appeal Court. I won't spend too much time on the facts because you can basically spend 2 days talking about the facts. But it's a case involving a Mr. Janssen, and his employer was basically legal aid. In short, the chronology of Mr. Janssen was that he commenced his employment in 2007, and by all accounts, please accept that he was an exemplary employee. His performance was generally quite good. There was no real gripe from his employer with his performance overall. However, in 2010, he was diagnosed with depression and anxiety, and in 2012, he wrote a letter to the CEO of Legal Aid informing them of his condition. Unfortunately, Legal Aid did not take this letter to heart, and effectively the response was that they ignored the plight. In 2013, however, Mr. Janssen's condition deteriorated, in fact, to such an extent that his prescription dose of antidepressants had even doubled by that stage. Even according to Mr. Janssen himself, around the period of August 2013, he wasn't acting rationally. He described himself as being off the wire, and at some stage he snapped and he basically locked himself up in his house, resulting in missed days of work, 17 missed days of work. When he eventually returned to his employer, he informed them of his depression and so on, but Legal Aid's response to that was that they stated, well, your unauthorized leave days would be unpaid leave. This resulted in some form of self-destructive behavior, and I might just add as a side note, Mr. Janssen had been going through a divorce as well, and just to add fuel to the fire or insult to injury, Legal Aid represented Mr. Janssen's wife against him in their divorce proceedings. Be that as it may, as I've mentioned, Mr. Janssen collapsed into this pattern of self-destruction, and on an occasion in August 2013, he turned his back on his employer and he walked away and he sort of just uttered, well, just fire me. On a different occasion, he failed to follow a reasonable instruction to attend to a prison visit, which ultimately cultivated into disciplinary charges being leveled against Mr. Janssen. I must just say that during this process, Janssen did seek assistance from Legal Aid's employee assistance program, and he had attended 4 psychological sessions with a Dr. Farr. His reports are quite extensive, but in essence, and I think it would just be apposite to read a paragraph out of the report, but she basically diagnosed him with reactive depression, and she stated that I would strongly recommend that Mr. Janssen be granted sick leave for a considerable amount of time. He needs to divorce himself from work and to try refocus and prioritize his life. Therapy alone is not enough. His resources for impulse control seem limited, therefore he needs time out. This is a case of great importance, please take note. This is a report directly written by his treating psychologist in relation to his state of mind at the time. However, in November 2013, Legal Aid took disciplinary action against Mr. Jansen, and they effectively charged him with 3 accounts, the one relating to the 17 days of absence, the other one relating to his insolence or his rudeness, where he just uttered the words, "just fire me," and the third one related to his refusal to follow a lawful instruction. Interestingly, during his disciplinary hearing, Mr. Jansen tried to rely on his psychologist's report. However, the disciplinary chairperson rejected this report on the basis that he wasn't going to call the author of the report. So it rejected the report on the basis of hearsay evidence. But then, unfortunately, at the end of his hearing, the chairperson found that he failed to prove his mental illness and rejected his evidence in that regard because he had failed to call Dr. Farr to come and testify to his psychological conditions. What then happened was that he was fired, and Mr. Jansen referred the matter to the Labour Court under the premises of Section 187(1)(f) of the Labour Relations Act, which deals with automatically unfair dismissals based on one of the prohibited grounds. The Labour Court held that his dismissal was automatically unfair on the grounds of a disability and was analogous to arbitrary grounds. The Labour Court also found that his dismissal constituted unfair discrimination within the meaning of Section 6 of the Employment Equity Act on the ground of disability or on analogous grounds. Legal Aid took the matter to the LAC, and this is where things take an interesting turn. Even though Mr. Jansen was ordered reinstatement, the LAC overturned the decision of the Labour Court and upheld the appeal on the basis that Jansen could not discharge the onus to prove that his depression was the factual and legal cause for his dismissal. The LAC held that to prove that his depression negated his ability to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct and to act in accordance with that distinction, essentially to satisfy held that he couldn't prove the dismissal, and the LAC essentially incorporated the test to satisfy the test for criminal incapacity when dealing with matters of mental illness and automatically unfair dismissals. So, in short, Mr. Jansen had to prove that Legal Aid had acted in a discriminatory motive or a fashion aimed specifically towards his mental illness. Now, perhaps if Mr. Jansen had called his treating psychologist to come and testify during his disciplinary hearing, all of this drama could have been avoided, but unfortunately that is not what happened. But the effect of the Labour Appeal Court judgment is that it places the onus squarely on the shoulders of the person suffering from mental illness to discharge the onus, or that the actual or the factual reason for his or her dismissal is based or premised on his or her mental illness. Now, this approach by the Labour Appeal Court, I am aware, is being taken on appeal to the Constitutional Court. As far as I know, the Constitutional Court has not yet granted leave to appeal towards the Constitutional Court directly, but we are hopeful, and I know that CDH is charging the assault on that front with Gillian Lum in our Cape Town offices who represented Mr. Jansen during these proceedings, and we are hoping that we will get a favourable response from the Constitutional Court. But perhaps just to give a short little comment on the effect of the LAC's judgment. When you look at Section 192 of the Labour Relations Act, the obligation ordinarily falls on the employer to prove that the reason for the dismissal was done for a fair reason. When dealing with constructive dismissal or automatically unfair dismissal issues based on one of the prohibited grounds, that onus seems to shift now onto the affected employee to prove that the dismissal was actually related to his or her mental illness, or one of the prohibited grounds being disability in this case. This is somewhat in stark contrast to one of the classical judgments in Crocombe, where the judge held that all that an employee really has to prove is a reasonable or a credible possibility that the reason for his or her dismissal is premised on one of the prohibited grounds. But that's the effect of the Janssen LAC judgment now, that it seems to place the bar a lot higher than just a reasonable or a credible possibility. It now seems to instill a sense that the person suffering from mental illness has to prove factually that his or her dismissal was premised on one of the prohibited grounds. So the effect of this judgment will have far-reaching consequences, particularly for employees suffering from mental illness, as the onus will fall on them to prove that the reason for the dismissal was because of their illness, and not necessarily the effects which the illness would have had in the workplace. Now, just to wrap up on my segment of the presentation, what can employers do in order to try and manage mental health issues in the workplace? I think it's fair to say that there are a wide range of matters that can arise in the employment relationship, which requires careful management in order to ensure a positive ongoing relationship is maintained. An effective stress management strategy must not only focus on work-related stresses, but also on building up a resilience for employees towards stresses, not only in the working environment, but perhaps in their personal lives as well. This may include awareness in relation to the role that they play in the organization, good nutrition, exercise and meditation, employee wellness and assistance programs where possible, increased job autonomy, such as work flexibility and creativeness in one's job, which creates a sense of self-fulfillment, and of course also the learning of new skills can all be incorporated in order to try and combat mental health issues in the workplace. If you are interested in developing programs like this in your workplace, you're welcome to reach out to CDH and as well as to Tanya to see how we can work together in order to try and develop a program which will build a resistance or resilience to mental health issues in your employees going forwards. On that note, I think there are just one or two more topical issues that also have a link into the issue of mental health. I'd like to hand over to Riola de Kock, who's just going to address the issue of employees refusing to come to work for various issues. Thanks, Riola.
Thank you very much, Michael. Good morning, everyone. My name is Riola Kock, and I am the CDH Employment Practice Professional Support Lawyer. What I'd like to end our discussion on is where an employee refuses to attend work, and that may either be due to reasons related to mental health or mental illness, or where an employee is simply being is abusing the system in relation to COVID-19. Now, as at 18 August 2020, South Africa was effectively placed on level 2. And in terms of level 2, most businesses are now permitted to operate. Companies are not only looking to commence operations, but they're also now looking to also have a return to work. And that now brings the question of what does an employer do when an employee refuses to attend work out of a fear of COVID-19? Now, there's really three categories of a refusal that I'd like us to look at, both in terms of the case law, but also the consolidated directive on health and safety in the workplace. The first category of employee that I'd like to look at is an employee who refuses to attend the office because they have a genuine belief that the employer has not made the working environment safe. Now, in terms of the Consolidated Health and Safety Directive that was published by the Department of Employment and Labour on the 4th of June, in terms of paragraph 48 thereof, an employee has a right to refuse to attend the workplace where they have a genuine belief that the workplace is not safe. Now, as we know, and it has been said in this webinar, Employers have an obligation both in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, as well as various other legislation to ensure that the workplace is indeed a safe environment. The paragraph 48 of the Consolidated Directive is also mirrored in the Mining Health and Safety Act, particularly section 23(1) thereof, and it reads as follows. So an employee has a right to leave any working place whenever circumstances arise such that that working place, on the basis of reasonable justification, appears to that employee to pose a serious danger to their particular health and safety. And so the first point to make is that an employee is well within their rights to refuse to attend the workplace where they have a genuine justified belief that the workplace is not a safe working environment. Now, if we look at the 2007 judgment of the Labour Court in Noom and others versus Grobler State Pty Limited, the court said that in order for an employee to rely on section 23(1) of the Mining Health and Safety Act, there must actually be evidence that there's a real threat and fear of safety. And so the subjective belief of the employee that the workplace is not safe must indeed be based on an objective information that the workplace is indeed not safe. And we are of the belief that the courts are going to look similarly if an employee were to challenge the safety of the workplace in terms of section 48 of the Consolidated Health and Safety Directive. So where it comes to a real issue of physical safety, an employee, like I've said, is allowed to refuse to attend work on a genuine, objective, reasonable basis that the workplace is indeed not safe. And of course, in an instance where an employer is remiss in terms of their obligations in the law, the employer must indeed comply with the law. Now, the reason I raised the issue of physical safety and the Consolidated Health and Safety Directive in a webinar concerning mental health is that one of the main contributing factors to poor mental health in this time is in fact a fear of not being safe. And therefore, when an employer creates a physical environment that makes an employee feel safe from a physical perspective, it is most likely that the employee will also have a better response in terms of their mental health. And so one must not overlook the interconnectedness between physical well-being and mental well-being. And therefore, the health and safety from a physical perspective in the workplace is equally as important as the mental health of an employee. The second category of employee that I think we must also look at is where an employee refuses to attend work simply on the basis of the employee being opportunistic and using the COVID-19 pandemic simply to avoid the accountability structures that exist when an employee attends the office as opposed to working from home. Now, where an employee abuses workplace policies, of course, this becomes an issue of misconduct, and an employer is well within their rights to deal with it as a misconduct issue on the basis of their internal code and procedure, together with the provisions of the Labour Relations Act. The third category of employee that I'd like to talk about is now more closely associated with the issue of mental health. And this is where an employee has a genuine fear of contracting the virus as a result of leaving their home. And so it's where an employee has actually either has an inflated sense of fear, or they have such a debilitating sense of fear around COVID-19 that they aren't able to leave their homes. Now, this may either be associated with the fact that an employee has various comorbidities and is therefore is at particular risk for contracting COVID-19. And of course, I must direct you to the guidance document by the Department of Health and the provisions on accommodating employees in that regard. An employee may also have previous mental health issues, and one must not overstate the post-traumatic stress disorder or depression that employees are in fact experiencing, either as a result of knowing someone that has either contracted COVID-19 quite severely, or maybe even having lost family members and friends to the pandemic. And so in this regard, obviously there is a genuine mental health issue there where an employee must in fact, and that would not become either a misconduct issue, and it wouldn't be an instance where the employer is remiss in terms of their obligations. Now, diagnosing mental health is something that must be done by a medical practitioner who is qualified in order to do so. And so where we're making issues, where we're raising issues around the incapacity of an employee as a result of their mental health, one must ensure that we involve the professionals in this determination and we get a report from qualified medical practitioners in this regard. Now, when you're dealing with an employee that is suffering from a debilitating sense of fear of contracting COVID-19 and therefore cannot attend work, there's various things that an employer can perhaps do. Certain or suggestions that we'd like to, provided that the proper structures are in place to ensure the employee is held accountable and that they remain productive within their working environment. Another strategy that an employer can employ is also to have an employee come to the workplace, but also in an isolated setting, in that the employee does not have interaction either with the public or either with various colleagues, if it's going to result in the employee having a heightened sense of fear of contracting the virus, and the employer seeks to eliminate those factors. And of course, as already has been stated by Tanya as well as Michael, an employer must try insofar as possible to provide support to those employees, either through any wellness programs or wellness plans that they either have in the workplace, as well as the institutions that Tanya mentioned that do provide these services for free. What I do want to say in terms of the law, and I'd like to cite the SCA judgment of 2014 in Kivitz-Kroon Country Estate versus Mamelodi and others, the court did say that it should be mentioned that an employer is not expected to tolerate an employee's prolonged absence of work due to mental health, and it may, if it is fair in the circumstances, and I must stress that because the courts will look at it in the context of COVID-19, if it is fair in the circumstances, they may exercise their election to terminate the employment relationship, where of course the incapacity cannot be accommodated in the workplace. We do of course encourage employers to comply with their policies in this regard, as well as the provisions of the LRA. In closing, I would also like to mention that the World Economic Forum in 2009 published a study on mental health in the workplace, and it was estimated that employers lose approximately 35% of all potential output as a result of poor mental health in their workplace. And so mental health is not just a private employee issue. It becomes a productivity issue, it becomes a performance issue, and it becomes a profitability issue. And so employers cannot simply relegate mental health as a private employee issue to be dealt with in their private capacity, but should take active steps to ensure that the workplace is, insofar as possible, a healthy working environment, and that mental health is spoken about quite freely. And therefore, we encourage employers to take a more robust approach. Some of the things that you can do is develop a wellness policy. And this wellness policy must obviously be circulated to employees to ensure that employees who suffer with mental health are all treated on a similar basis. To circulate the resources that you either have in-house, or to refer employees to other resources where they may receive free assistance in this regard. And please refer to Tanya's presentation when it has been sent to you for some of those resources that are available. The last point that I'd like to make before handing back to Michael is that issues around an employee's health is considered special personal information in terms of the Protection of Information, the Protection of Personal Information Act. And therefore, an employer may not process or store this information without the employee's consent, subject to the exceptions listed in Section 27 of POPI. Therefore, when you are creating a wellness policy or you are collecting medical records, etc., of an employee who is suffering with mental health, I encourage you to take the provisions of POPI into consideration and ensure that you are doing it in a way that complies with the provisions of POPI and ensures the privacy and confidentiality of that employee's information. Thank you very much, and I'd like to hand back to Michael.
Great, thank you very much, both to Tanya and to Riola. I think that we have bombarded everybody with a lot of information, but anybody who is listening to this presentation, please know that you can revisit this this webinar on our YouTube channel. CDH has got its own YouTube channel. We also try to distribute these presentations via our website, cliffdeckerhoffmeyer.com, and also via Twitter and other social media platforms. So feel free to revisit what we have said. We hope that you have found everything to be relevant and informative, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future. I know that we have seen some questions next to the side of the presentation. If we haven't dealt with any of your questions yet, we will revert back to you. We will also be sending you links to Tanya's presentation and this webinar, and I will also be drafting an article outlining the Janssen judgment and what I've spoken about as well, and together with what Riola has mentioned in terms of copy, which will be distributed via our usual channels as well. If you are not on any of our distribution groups, please reach out to our marketing team or to myself, and we'll be happy to place you on our distribution channels so that you can continue receiving these kind of webinar links, also our articles and so on going forwards. Thank you for your time. I know that we've overrun. We've loved giving this presentation to you, and I wish you a great day going forwards. Keep well. Thank you.